She said I see you too clearly, and that's the problem. The first time I met my friend's aunt, I didn't realize how much she would unsettle me. It was a warm Saturday afternoon, the kind that drapes golden light over everything, softening edges and making small details shimmer. I had gone to her house with my friend, just a casual drop-in, really, and the atmosphere inside felt unexpectedly intimate. She was standing in the kitchen, quietly arranging flowers in a vase, a subtle concentration in her movements that made her seem both calm and deliberate. She was 40, but there was an elegance about her that made her seem untouchably composed. Her hair was shoulder-length, softly curled at the ends, and the way she tucked a strand behind her ear without looking up gave me the strange impression that she noticed everything. The moment our eyes met, I felt a flicker of recognition, as if she had already seen me before I even arrived. It was not a glance of judgment, but something deeper, an awareness that made me immediately self-conscious. The room smelled faintly of coffee and roses, a combination that was both comforting and intoxicating. I reached for a plate at the same time she did, and our hands brushed. It was fleeting, almost laughably ordinary, but I felt the subtle warmth of her touch linger longer than it should. She smiled, just the tiniest curve of her lips, and for a second, the air between us seemed charged with something I couldn't name. She spoke softly when introducing herself, her voice calm yet precise, carrying an unspoken weight of experience. I noticed the way she tilted her head, listening attentively, her eyes narrowing slightly in curiosity. Even in casual conversation, she gave the impression that she could see past the surface, past my nervous attempts to sound composed, to the thoughts I didn't say out loud. There was a strange pull, a quiet gravity, in the way she existed in the room, and I found myself unconsciously mirroring her movements, leaning slightly closer, hoping not to overstep. For the rest of the visit, she hovered in my awareness like a gentle tide. Her laughter was quiet but full, echoing softly across the living room, making the space feel smaller in the most intimate way. When she handed me a cup of tea, our fingers brushed again. This time, I didn't pull away so quickly, and for a moment, we lingered in that small contact, an unspoken acknowledgement of a connection that neither of us named. Even now, thinking back to that afternoon, I remember the way her eyes seemed to hold more than just curiosity. A glimmer of something personal, something dangerous for a young man like me to notice. I didn't know it then, but in that moment, the slow pull of something forbidden and intoxicating had begun, and I was already caught in its quiet, unrelenting current. After that first afternoon, I couldn't stop noticing her. Not in a reckless way, at least I told myself it wasn't reckless, but she had a way of lingering in my peripheral vision, of turning ordinary moments into something that felt charged, almost electric. At family gatherings or casual meetups, she moved through the room with a quiet assurance, and yet I felt as if she always knew when I was watching. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible attention, the kind that could be easily dismissed if you weren't paying close enough attention. She would tilt her head slightly, or the corner of her lips would twitch in a half-smile when I caught her eyes, and my chest would tighten without warning. There was no need for words. She didn't have to say anything. The way she looked at me, the tiny pauses she allowed when I spoke, the small, deliberate gestures she made. It all whispered a quiet intimacy I wasn't sure I deserved. I became self-conscious in ways I hadn't anticipated. I noticed the lines of her hands as she reached for a glass, the graceful curve of her shoulders as she leaned over to adjust a chair, the faint warmth of her perfume when we were near. Every laugh she let out, every casual tilt of her head, felt like it was directed toward me in a way that made my pulse uneven. I questioned myself constantly. Was I reading too much into it? Or was she intentionally giving me glimpses into a world I wasn't supposed to see? One afternoon, my friend and I helped her with groceries. As I set a bag down on the counter, she reached over, brushing my hand lightly with hers as she guided the bag into place. The contact was so brief, so ordinary on the surface, but it sent an unexpected shiver through me. She caught my eyes immediately, her gaze steady and knowing, and for a heartbeat, it felt as if she had looked directly into the corners of my mind. There were moments of playful teasing, too. A comment here, a sly smile there. Nothing overt, but enough to make me question my own composure. She had a way of speaking that made me aware of my own nervousness, as if she could feel the thoughts I couldn't speak aloud. And yet, there was no judgment in her gaze, only a subtle recognition that unsettled me, made me feel exposed, and yet inexplicably drawn in. By the end of that day, I realized she had begun to occupy my thoughts in ways I hadn't expected. I found myself replaying our interactions, dissecting each glance, each brush of hands, each carefully measured pause. She had this uncanny ability to make ordinary moments feel like private conversations, to make proximity feel intimate without ever crossing the line. And I knew even then that I was treading dangerous ground, not because of anything overt she had done, but because of the way she made me feel. Seen, noticed, and entirely alive in ways I hadn't been before. I was caught between fascination and hesitation, and that tension, as subtle as it was, became the quiet rhythm of my days whenever she was near. It happened one quiet afternoon, long after the laughter of a family gathering had faded and the air had settled into something softer, warmer. My friend had gone out for errands, leaving me alone with his aunt, the woman who had quietly taken up residence in my thoughts. I had come over under the pretense of helping her with something small, perhaps carrying in groceries or tidying the living room. But the world around us seemed to shrink, leaving only the two of us in a space that felt unexpectedly intimate. She was leaning against the kitchen counter, her posture relaxed but poised, a faint crease of concentration on her brow as she traced the rim of a coffee mug with her finger. I watched her, as I often did now, drawn to the quiet way she moved, the subtle grace in every gesture. There was a moment, just a flicker of hesitation, when she looked up, caught my gaze and didn't look away. Not immediately. Not until I felt my pulse thudding against my chest and I realized that for a moment, we were holding something unspoken between us. We began talking, and it wasn't about anything grand or dramatic. She spoke of small frustrations at work, of a dream she had once nurtured but never pursued. I shared my own nervous excitement about a project I was working on, fumbling slightly as I tried to explain the details without sounding foolish. And yet, there was no judgment, no impatience. Only that rare, careful attention that made me feel like she truly wanted to understand me. At one point, she reached over to steady a stack of books I had accidentally nudged, her fingers brushing mine briefly. The contact was light, almost accidental, yet it carried an unexpected weight. I noticed the warmth of her hand, the slight tremor as she held it just a fraction longer than necessary, as if testing the waters of this new intimacy. Her eyes softened, and I realized she was allowing me to see more than she usually revealed, that she trusted me with something private. The room smelled faintly of coffee and the faint perfume she always wore, a comforting mix that seemed to settle over us like a warm blanket. Outside, the sun streamed through the window, catching in the strands of her hair and making the small moments between us feel almost cinematic, suspended in time. I felt a strange courage welling up inside me, the courage to be honest, to meet her vulnerability with my own. We lingered over stories neither of us had planned to share. There were pauses, comfortable and tense all at once, where our eyes met and held a quiet acknowledgement of the connection forming. A laugh here, a shared look there, each small gesture quietly weaving a thread between us. For the first time, I sensed that she was not just the confident, composed woman everyone saw at gatherings. She had a private side, a softness that she allowed only when she felt safe. By the time my friend returned, the atmosphere had shifted. There was a subtle understanding between us now, an unspoken acknowledgement of the bond forming quietly but insistently. I left that day with a heightened awareness of her presence in my life, the way she made ordinary moments feel profound, the way she allowed herself to be seen, and the way I wanted to see her, completely without reservation. The tension between us had been building quietly, almost imperceptibly, until one evening, it finally seemed impossible to ignore. I was at her home again, helping her organize some paperwork she had been putting off. The room filled with the faint smell of tea and old books. There was a softness in the lighting. The sun was dipping low, brushing the room in amber hues, but the warmth of the light did nothing to soothe the tightening knot in my chest. We were sitting across from each other at the dining table, stacks of papers between us, and I found myself acutely aware of her presence. Every small movement she made seemed deliberate, every glance weighted with meaning. She leaned slightly forward to point something out on a page, and her hand hovered just above mine, the tips brushing for a heartbeat before she pulled back. It was a small, almost inconsequential gesture, but my pulse spiked in a way I couldn't control. She looked at me then, really looked, with eyes that seemed to strip away the careful barriers I had built around myself. And in that look I saw recognition. Not casual recognition, but a knowing that both excited and terrified me. For a moment, I thought she might speak, might break the delicate silence with words that would either soothe or shatter the fragile balance we had maintained. Instead, she smiled faintly, a smile that carried amusement, curiosity, and something dangerously intimate. We began to talk, tentatively at first, about boundaries and propriety, about the strange dynamics of our age difference and the complications that came with it. She didn't accuse or admonish, but her words were loaded with implication, highlighting the very real tension that simmered beneath the surface. I felt my own cheeks warm, my thoughts scrambling to keep pace with the honesty in her voice. At one point, she leaned slightly closer to emphasize a point, and her hand brushed my knee. My body reacted before my mind could. A subtle tightening of muscles, a fleeting shiver that neither of us commented on. She caught my gaze immediately, her eyes steady, measuring, and something unspoken passed between us. I realized then how close we had come to crossing a line, and yet how impossible it felt to step away completely. We laughed nervously at an awkward pause, but even the laughter did little to dissipate the electricity that hung in the air. Every shared glance, every casual brush of skin, felt magnified, charged with possibility and risk. I was painfully aware of the family dynamics, the age gap, and the societal expectations that made every thought of crossing the line feel like a rebellion. And yet, in her presence, every rational boundary felt simultaneously necessary and insufficient. By the time I left that evening, my mind was a storm of longing, hesitation, and fascination. I replayed each gesture, each look, each pause, as if decoding a secret language only we understood. She had become a mirror for my own unspoken desires, reflecting them back with clarity and intensity, and I knew that the path forward would be fraught with temptation and restraint. That night, as I lay awake, I realized the truth. The tension between us was no longer subtle. It had grown into something palpable, a quiet storm that promised both exhilaration and danger. And I could feel, with a clarity that was almost painful, that we were standing on the edge of something that could change everything, if either of us allowed ourselves to step closer. It was late one evening, the kind of night where the world feels smaller, softer, and almost fragile. The house was quiet, the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards the only sounds. We had ended up in the kitchen, sitting across from each other at the small table, a single lamp casting a warm glow over everything. Outside, the night was calm, a gentle breeze rustling the leaves just beyond the window, carrying the faint scent of jasmine from her garden. We had been talking for a while, at first about trivial things, the kind of light conversation that eases tension. But gradually, the words shifted, guided by a silent gravity neither of us resisted. She looked at me then, really looked, with those eyes that seemed to see past my surface-level composure, past the carefully constructed mask I usually wore. And I felt something crack inside me, a barrier I hadn't even realized I had built. "I know you notice me," she said softly, almost whispering, her fingers drumming lightly on the edge of the table. The words weren't an accusation, they were an acknowledgement, an invitation. My heart tightened. "And I notice you noticing me. That's complicated." I swallowed, feeling the weight of my own truth pressing forward. "I do notice," I admitted, my voice quieter than I intended, almost lost in the soft hum of the night. "More than I should, and I can't stop thinking about it." There was a pause, a delicate, fragile silence where the air seemed to thicken between us. She leaned slightly forward, and our shoulders brushed. The contact was brief, almost accidental, yet it sent a jolt through me that made my chest feel tight and warm all at once. I could feel the subtle heat of her presence, the quiet strength in the way she leaned in, willing to let me see her without retreating behind the usual composure she carried around others. "I felt it too," she admitted finally, her voice soft but steady. "I've felt it since the beginning. The way you look at me, the way you notice things about me that no one else does. It's unsettling and exhilarating all at once." She paused, giving me space to absorb her words, and then added with a small, almost shy smile, "And it's why I'm being careful. Because what we feel, it's real, but it's also complicated." Her confession settled over me like a weight I had been both longing for and dreading. It wasn't just about desire, it was about honesty, about recognition, about two people acknowledging the magnetic pull between them without letting it consume everything else. I reached out, my hand hovering near hers on the table, hesitant. She didn't pull away, only let her fingers brush mine. A tiny, grounding connection that spoke volumes. We sat there for a long time, talking quietly, honestly, without needing grand gestures or dramatic declarations. The intimacy wasn't physical yet. It was emotional, raw, and real. For the first time, I felt like we had entered a space where pretense didn't exist, where the slow-burning connection between us could be acknowledged without shame or guilt. By the time I left that night, I carried a new understanding with me. Of her, of myself, of the invisible bond forming between us. There was desire, yes, but also something far deeper. Trust, recognition, and the courage to see each other as we truly were. And I knew that whatever happened next, this quiet confession had changed everything. The days after our quiet confession were strange, charged with a tension that hovered in the air, tangible but unspoken. Every encounter felt heavier, more deliberate, as if we were both acutely aware of the distance we could cross and the line we might almost reach. And yet, despite the weight of that awareness, there was a comfort now, a warmth that had been absent before. It wasn't reckless, it wasn't rushed. It was slow, deliberate, and patient, the kind of intimacy that built itself in small gestures rather than grand declarations. We found ourselves together one rainy afternoon, the soft patter of rain against the window filling the otherwise quiet room. I had come over to help her sort through some old photographs, a task mundane on the surface but charged with meaning in this new context. She sat close to me on the couch, leaning slightly as she pointed out a picture, her shoulder brushing mine. The contact was subtle, fleeting, but it sent a shiver through me, the warmth of her presence suddenly undeniable. She laughed softly at something I said, and as I reached to hand her a photograph, our fingers touched, lingering slightly longer than necessary. Her eyes met mine, steady and knowing, and I felt the pulse of something unspoken pass between us. There was a hesitation in her smile, a subtle acknowledgement of the magnetic pull that neither of us could deny but that both of us were careful to respect. As the afternoon drifted on, the space between us grew smaller without either of us commenting on it. She adjusted her position, her hand brushing lightly against mine again, and I caught the faint scent of her perfume, something warm and floral, comforting and intoxicating all at once. Every small gesture, every shared glance, carried the weight of unspoken desire, and yet there was restraint, a deliberate care that made the intimacy feel more profound. At one point, she rested her hand lightly on my forearm as she laughed at a memory in the photographs. The contact was casual, natural, and yet it felt significant, a tiny bridge across the line we had both been careful not to cross. I felt my heart tighten, my chest warm, and for a moment, time seemed suspended, the rest of the world fading into the background. We paused to look out the window at the rain, and without thinking, I leaned slightly closer. She didn't move away. Our shoulders touched, and the proximity felt both thrilling and grounding. I noticed the subtle warmth of her hand near mine, the way her hair fell across her shoulder, the quiet rhythm of her breathing. It was intimate yet safe, a delicate balance we were learning to navigate together. By the time the rain had softened into a drizzle, the energy between us had shifted. We hadn't spoken of desire in words, but in every glance, every brush of skin, every lingering smile, the tension had been acknowledged. It was a slow, careful crossing of lines, a dance of proximity and restraint, desire and understanding. And in that moment, I realized that the connection between us had deepened, becoming something tangible, something that neither words nor gestures could fully contain. The connection between us had grown quietly, almost imperceptibly, until it was undeniable. By the time that evening arrived, the air was thick with unspoken understanding. I had gone over under the guise of helping her with some last-minute household chores, but the real reason, even I admitted it to myself, was to be near her. The house was calm, a soft glow from the lamps filling each corner with warmth. Outside, the night was still, the faint hum of distant traffic mingling with the subtle rustle of trees swaying in the wind. We found ourselves in the living room, sitting side by side on the couch, our shoulders brushing lightly. The closeness was comfortable now, no longer tentative or fraught with hesitation, but it carried a quiet gravity, a recognition of everything we had shared, everything we had confessed, and everything we could never say aloud. There was a pause, a silence that was not empty, but full of awareness, a shared acknowledgement of the bond that had been quietly threading itself between us. "I've never met anyone who makes me feel like this," she said softly, almost a whisper, her hand brushing lightly against mine. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. She wasn't falling into my arms, nor was I pulling her closer, but the touch was meaningful, deliberate, and grounding. It spoke of trust, of recognition, of a connection that went far beyond casual attraction. I felt the warmth of her hand, the subtle pressure of her fingers against mine, and it grounded me in a way that words could never achieve. "I feel the same," I admitted, my voice low, carrying all the weight of my emotions. "More than I ever expected." There was no urgency in my words, no desperate need to act on the feelings that had built between us over weeks and months. It was simply an acknowledgement, an honest recognition of what had grown naturally between two people who had chosen to see each other fully. We talked then, quietly and honestly, about boundaries, about life, about the complications of our age difference, and about the respect we held for each other. There was laughter, too soft, genuine, and effortless, filling the spaces between the heavier, more introspective moments. And in those moments, I realized that what we had built was rare. A slow-burn intimacy that didn't rely on grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but on subtle, deliberate acts of care, trust, and attention. As the night drew on, we stood together near the doorway. Her hand lingered on my forearm for just a heartbeat longer than necessary, and I met her eyes, seeing reflected there the same mix of longing, respect, and quiet certainty that I felt myself. This matters," she said simply, and I nodded, feeling a profound sense of clarity. Did matter. It mattered deeply. We parted that night with a lingering embrace, gentle and grounding, a promise without words that we had seen each other, fully and honestly, and that the connection we shared would endure in whatever form life allowed. Walking away, I felt a mixture of longing and satisfaction, knowing that our story was complete in its own way. Not necessarily conventional, not necessarily easy, but profoundly human and undeniably real. And as I stepped out into the cool night air, I carried with me the memory of her warmth, her presence, and the unspoken understanding between us. A bond that had changed me forever, leaving me quietly, irrevocably altered. If this story left your heart racing or made you feel every stolen glance, don't forget to hit like and subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Who do you think notices more, him or her? Stay tuned for more slow burn romances that linger long after the video ends.